Hey there everybody, welcome to today's video. Today we're going to take this black vanity and transform it for my daughter's Christmas present. Be sure to stick around to the end to get her reaction. First things first, I had to try and pull this drawer out from the vanity, but didn't realize that there was a stopper directly plugged into the vanity that stopped it from coming out. Next step is to take out the screws. First, I needed to take them out of the chair so I could paint the chair to match the vanity. Then after that, we will take them out of the mirror. Good thing to note here is anytime you're working with screws or small pieces, you want to have some type of container or bag that you can put them all in. Notice here I do have a Ziploc bag that we're going to be putting all the screws in, but even something like a cleaned out sour cream dish or cottage cheese dish or something would work just as well, as long as it's dedicated to your project so you don't lose anything. The next step is to clean the vanity. We want to make sure we remove all the grease, dirt, grime, and anything else off of it before we continue. I like to use Trisodium Phosphate, or TSP for short, in a squirt bottle that can dilute it and apply very easily. There are other ways you can do this, of course, something from the Dollar Tree or your local grocery store. This just happens to work best for me. And now it's time to sand the vanity. Here I'm going to use my Worx Sandeck sander with the detail head and 120 grit sandpaper. So what we're looking to do here is to scuff sand the vanity. We are not looking to get down to bare wood, but because I didn't know how thick the paint and top coat were on the vanity, we went with the 120 grit rather than the 150 or 180 grit. The goal of scuff sanding your piece is to make sure that when you put down your layer of primer or paint, it actually has something to adhere to. Make sure that whenever you're sanding, you wear some type of protective cover over your mouth, whether that is a mask or a respirator. You just want to try and protect yourself from any of the particulates that end up in the air from your sanding from getting into your lungs. Now here you see me using a sanding sponge with 120 grit sandpaper by hand, and there is a lot of ways you can actually do this, especially around the rounded areas of your piece. It's really hard to use an electric sander of any form in something like that. You could, but it's difficult. Now that our sanding is complete, we need to wipe up all of that dust, and the best way to do that is to use a damp, lint-free cloth. And it doesn't have to be anything special, simple water will do. Just to show you what we wiped up there after sanding and wiping it down. Pretty gross. And now it's time to load the primer into the sprayer. Notice that I'm using a filter to filter out the primer. The reason being, we never know what gets into the can after we've resealed it. And so you always want to make sure you use a filter so it doesn't clog your sprayer as you spray. For this project, we're using Zinsser's 123, which is a water-based primer. Something good to have around if you use a sprayer is cardboard. Lots and lots of cardboard. Before you even touch your piece of furniture, you want to make sure that your sprayer is spraying the pattern that you're looking for with the correct amount of paint or primer at the correct amount of force. Here, as I was testing it, it wouldn't spray correctly, and I noticed that it was coming out too thick. So I added some water to help dilute down the primer a little bit so I could get a better spray pattern. Now that we got the spray pattern right, it's time to put down our first layer of primer on our vanity. Notice that when I'm spraying, I'm starting and ending off of the vanity. The reason being is when you first start spraying and when you stop spraying, that little bit of paint always splatters, and you don't want that to get onto your furniture. You always want to make sure that whenever you're spraying your furniture, it's very uniform. So you always want to start and end off of your furniture. Now that our primer is dry, I'm using a 320 grit sanding sponge to sand down any bumps or ridges that may have set in from the paint itself. You probably also noticed the runs in the paint, and the reason is those areas were not entirely dry, they were a little too thick, so we're going to make sure we take care of that as well. After sanding and wiping off all the dust, it was time to put down our second layer of primer. In the end, we ended up putting down 3 layers of primer, the last layer being very thin. The trickiest part to this whole thing was the mirror. I was initially thinking of using paper, but paper didn't work with the circular mirror to begin with. So I ended up just using tape, and we taped up the entire mirror so that paint didn't get underneath it. Now the tool that I'm using here is called a 5-in-1 painter's tool, and the way I'm using it is to make sure that the ends of the tape is as snug to the edges of the mirror as possible so that paint doesn't somehow get underneath the edges and get paint overspray on the mirror itself. Now to get off all the excess tape, I'm using this OLFA rotary cutter. Generally it's used on fabric, but in this case it worked perfectly to get in between the mirror and the frame to get all the excess tape off. Other things you can use here is a simple razor blade or a box cutter or a pair of scissors or whatnot. I just happen to have this around. Now it's time to work on the drawer. Always make sure to use a respirator whenever you use paints, and in this case I'm going to be using the Rust-Oleum paint and primer spray paint rather than the Zinsser 123 we used earlier. Whenever you're using spray paint, it's always better to have many layers of thin coats rather than a few really thick coats. Too much can go wrong too fast, and you get better coverage when you use short bursts of thin layers. For the drawer, we ended up doing 3 thin layers of the paint and primer spray paint to make sure that it was fully covered. Then we had to work on the mirror and the side frames of the mirror, and we used the same technique we did on the drawer. And now it's time to paint the vanity. Today we're using Benjamin Moore semi-gloss paint and primer in the color Rhododendron. It's the color my daughter chose. Now this paint does come with a primer, but I tend to primer my furniture separately for good measure. Notice again, we're using a filter when we pour in our paint into the sprayer. We always want to use a filter. So I know this paint is a little thick, so I'm diluting it just a bit so that when we spray it, we have a better spray pattern. And before we start painting, we want to make sure that we sand down our last layer of primer with that 320 grit sanding sponge to take down all the ridges, but to also give an abrasion on the surface so that our next layer of paint has something to adhere to. And again, we always want to test our sprayer before we start spraying our furniture. This allows us the ability to dial in our sprayer for the best spray possible. Even after diluting the paint the first time, I found that it was still too thick coming out of the sprayer, so here I'm actually putting in a little bit more water to dilute it just a bit more for a better spray pattern. Before getting started, I wanted to do one last test on the spray and make sure that my sweeping motions were having good coverage before actually doing it on the furniture itself. Now that we got everything figured out, it's time to put down our first layer of paint. Now that the vanity and chair are both fully painted, it's time to add some pizzazz. In this case, it's adding some silver gilding wax from Dixie Belle. Now to add gilding wax is really not that difficult. You just add a little bit of the wax to your finger or a small brush, and you gently rub it onto the area that you're wanting to apply it to. In this case, I wanted to add it to the emblems on both sides and that little rope section in between to give it a little pop. And we do the same with the vanity. Now when you get done, most likely you're going to have a few marks that were outside of the area you wanted to put it on, and they're easily able to be cleaned up with these mineral spirits and a rag. Just put a little bit of mineral spirit on a rag and gently wipe it up. It'll come right off. Now it's time to prepare for our top coat. Just like with every layer of paint and primer, we also want to rub this down with the 320 grit sanding sponge, or in this case, the 320 grit sandpaper on the sanding sponge to give an adhesion for the top coat to go onto. Our top coat is going to be using Minwax water-based polycrylic in semi-gloss. If you've enjoyed this video so far, be sure to like and subscribe, and click that notification bell so you get notified whenever a new video comes out. Now it's time to clean out the drawer and get it ready. Now to clean out the inside of the drawer, I put some TSP spray on the rag and wiped down the inside. I really didn't need too much. It was fairly clean to begin with. And notice why I added the tape to the holes of the hardware. Paint will always go inside the holes when you're spraying. This is a custom design I had made for my daughter, and I had it made in a sticker form and have been holding on to it for a long time, waiting for the right time to give it to her. And I believe this present is the perfect time and the perfect place to give it to her. If you'd like a copy of that for yourself, I'll leave a link in the description below. Now it's time to remove all of that tape from the mirror. Let's slow down for a second and take this in. Something about removing the last couple strands of tape is just so satisfying. Now it's time to put the hardware back in. And if you stayed with us this long, you're in for a treat, because right after this, we're going to be getting Shasta's reaction to her new Christmas present.
Ow. Ow. My pink stuff. I like it.
You like it? Good.
Wait, what the heck?
No, 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 no.
And I also have a table.
It's a chair.
Chair.
Mm-hmm. It's beautiful.
But I need makeup with it.
Well, sit down.
Yeah. Yeah. I like it.
Hey there! I really hope you enjoyed that makeover. If you haven't yet, be sure to subscribe for more videos and hit that notification bell so you're notified anytime a new video comes out. If you're looking for more flips like this, be sure to click on one of these videos right here. And as always, have an amazing day.